German free market liberals back from the dead. Germany's business-oriented Free Democratic Party (FDP) is technically still in government, but to all intents and purposes the party is dead. The question now is whether its new leader, Christine Lindner, can revive it. In the United States, you have to be at least 35 years of age before you can be elected president. In Germany, you can be 40 years young and already have your political career behind you. This is what had happened to the FDP's Philipp Rösler, who at the moment is still Chancellor Merkel's deputy, the so-called vice-chancellor. He will lose this office just before Christmas, when Merkel's conservatives and the left-of-center Social Democrats put the ink on their heavily debated coalition agreement. But that's not the only office Rösler is losing. He's also stepped down as FDP chairman following his party's historic defeat in the general election in September. The German electorate ejected the FDP from the Bundestag, the lower house of parliament, which it had been a part of since its inception 46 years ago, by giving the party less than 5% of the vote. Youthful bearer of hope, the FDP has been part of more governments in post-war Germany than any other party. It supplied Germany's first president, Theodor Heuss, in 1949, and one of the world's most influential foreign ministers, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, from 1974 until 1992. A look back at German history and the history of the FDP is proof that the party's fall from grace truly is a historic milestone. This was the language used by Christine Lindner, the new head of the party, who was elected at the FDP annual conference this weekend with some 80% of the vote. Like Rösler, he is young, just 34 years of age. The resounding majority of FDP members, however, are confident that Lindner is mature enough to lead their party better than Rösler. At this weekend's conference in Berlin, Rösler took responsibility for the FDP's fall from grace, saying that what he found most painful was his failure to live up to his own and the party's acceptation. New start in opposition. According to Lindner, who is now at the FDP helm, the party is at the beginning of a process of resurgence, which will start off in a new arena, the opposition. In Berlin, he pronounced at an immediate end to the period of mourning that the party had been experiencing since the federal election, and defended the FDP's stance during the past 4 years in coalition with Merkel Conservative Christian Democratic Union (CDU). In his first speech as party head, he also paid tribute to the FDP's historical contributions to the development of modern Germany, such as the implementation of the social market economy in the 1950s, a new modern social politics in the 70s, and battling Germany's sovereign debt since the 1990s. Judging by September's election results, however, voters weren't interested in the extent to which the Free Democrats contributed to these developments. Lindner indicated that FDP could not rest on old laurels. The strength of yesteryear must be given new life. In other words, his party must resurrect political liberalism in Germany, which seems to have given up the ghost. Lindner's objective is to make it back into the Bundestag in the 2017 federal election, but some FDP supporters may secretly be hoping for a snap election, a hope encouraged by what seemed to be tricky coalition negotiation between the CDU and the SPD. The SPD had yet to approve the coalition. Lindner and his new team, however, are not looking to focus on the weakness of the competition. It's time to concentrate on the party's strengths, he stressed, with a sense of optimism that's been sorely missed in the FDP ranks for some years now. A new Cold War in the Arctic? The Arctic is heating up, both climatically and militarily, but experts differ in their views on whether the region, with its vast shipping opportunities and energy resources, could become the site of the next Cold War. Russia's responses to Canada's announced plans to extend its territorial claim in the Arctic is the latest in a series of moves by countries sharing coastlines along the vast polar ocean. Tension is on the rise as Russia, Canada, Denmark, Norway, and the United States seek to assert jurisdiction over parts of the warming Arctic and claim rights to the seafloor assets as well as protecting their borders. There is some overlap. Everyone acknowledges that, said Robert Hubert, Associate Director of the Center for Military and Strategic Studies at the University of Calgary. The rising interest in the region is being driven, in large part, by climate change. Ice in the Arctic Ocean shrank last year to its lowest level since satellites began monitoring it more than 4 decades ago. Many scientists now believe that by the middle of this century, it could vanish altogether in the summer months. Vast oil and gas reserve. Already ships are taking advantage of open polar waters to navigate a shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific, and competition for oil and gas is intensifying in contested, overlapping areas. The Arctic is believed to hold up to a quarter of the planet's undiscovered oil and gas reserves. Nations with continental shelves extending into the vast 18 million square meter polar region are now vying for a chunk of it. Under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, a country can secure control of the ocean floor beyond the internationally recognized 200 nautical mile limit, provided it can demonstrate the seabed is an extension of its continental shelf. On Monday, Canada said it intended to extend its territorial claim in the Arctic all the way to the North Pole, although it hasn't yet fully mapped the area and doesn't have scientific evidence to back its claim. Prime Minister Stephen Harper stepped in at the last minute to insist that the North Pole be included in Canada's claim after a scientific assessment submitted on deadline to the UN a week earlier put the boundary just south of the pole. Symbolic claim. I think the Prime Minister did not want to be accused by the media and his political opponents that he had surrendered the North Pole, said Michelle Bayer, a professor of global politics and international law at the University of British Columbia and the author of Who Owns the Arctic, noting that the Convention of the Law of the Sea allows data to be submitted at a later date. I think he just didn't want to have to explain that the door wasn't closed, he told DW. In 2007, Russia staked a symbolic claim to its seabed in 2007 by dropping a canister containing the Russian national flag on the ocean floor at the North Pole. Its response to the Canadian move, however, was less symbolic. It flexed its military muscle. On Tuesday, Russia President Vladimir Putin provided the country's armed forces to expand their presence in the Arctic, describing the region in a meeting with top military brass as crucial to the country's economic future and security. That move came after he announced in September the reopening of the former Soviet military base in the Arctic. Since being elected to a third presidential term, the Russian president has been seeking to revive Russia's Soviet-era clout and military might amid disputes over the U.S.-led NATO missiles shield and other disputes. Some experts put Russia's security concerns at par or even above its economic interests in the Arctic. Nuclear deterrent. Now that Russia has recovered economically, it wants to build up its military capabilities again, also in the Arctic, said Hubert. The core security policy of Russia, as it is for the US, France, the UK, Israel, and India, is nuclear deterrence, and Russia's primary nuclear deterrent is its submarine force. Hubert sees potential for greater tension in the long term. As Russia improves its submarine capabilities and nuclear deterrence, its military activities will increase, and that, in turn, will trigger a response from NATO, he said. The U.S. is on the alert. In November, U.S. Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel announced the Pentagon's first Arctic strategy to involve its infrastructure and capabilities to defend U.S. sovereignty in and around Alaska, while working to help ensure freedom of the seas. Fort Greely, about 100 miles southeast of Fairbanks, is one of the country's primary sites for launching anti-ballistic missiles. But what involved means in concrete terms remains to be seen, according to Heather Conley, an Arctic expert at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. From a Washington perspective, the state of Alaska, our Arctic reach, seems to be very far away. It's a long-term issue that doesn't require immediate attention, she told DW. Arctic sunrise. As for Russia, Conley said its increased military interest in the Arctic should come as no surprise. given that the country holds 50% of Arctic coastline and needs to protect this area as shipping traffic grows. But she warns that incidents such as the recent seizure of the Greenpeace vessel, the Arctic Sunrise, by Russian security officers warrant attention. Commercial opportunities weigh heavily in Russia's Arctic strategy. According to Conley, Russians need the Arctic to be stable because they have such ambitious plans for economic development there. They see it as their 21st century resource base, she said. If there is instability in the region, companies won't invest. Bayer agrees, pointing to Russia's membership in the World Trade Organization as an indication of its economic interests. And apart from that, he added, the country can't afford to militarize the Arctic. The expense would be prohibitive. Norway, we have a new East-West conflict. An OSCE meeting took place in Kiev as Ukrainians held pro-European protests, but the group has lost its importance, says international law expert Manfred Norwig, because the West and Russia are drifting apart. Nearly 40 years ago, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, then Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, CSCE, initiated the process which led to the end of the Cold War. Today, the OSCE is in its deepest crisis since its founding. The basic principle that decisions are made by consensus with all 57 member states often leaves the OSCE hamstrung on important issues. DW. Mr. Norwig, today, decades after the end of the Cold War, does the OSCE still have significance? Many people thought that the OSCE has accomplished an important task after the implosion of the Soviet Union and other communist regimes in 1989 in Europe. In 1975, no one thought that this organization, designed to ease tensions, would ever have such important consequences. But soon after the fall of the Iron Curtain, it became apparent that the ideological vacuum which followed in Central and Eastern European states was filled by nationality and minority conflicts. In the 90s, the main relevance of the OSCE was then to solve conflicts through quiet diplomacy on a preventative level. For example, with the High Commissioner for National Minority, and secondly, in cases of armed conflicts, in particular in the Balkan and partially in the Caucasus as well. The OSCE, often together with the United Nations, carried out large peace missions under the banner of comprehensive security. Nevertheless, the USCE now plays a minor role in the foreign policy debate. Until 2010, there were no meetings for 11 years, and its Secretary General is hardly known to the public. Is there an existential crisis of confidence in the OSCE? Certainly, the OSCE lost a lot of its importance. On the one hand, because of the September 11 attack, and on the other, because a new East-West conflict appeared between the U.S. under President George Washington Bush and the Russian Federation under Vladimir Putin. There was mutual distrust instead of trust, and because of the consensus principle, the OSCE is incapable of making decisions in significant areas. Think of the war between Russia and Georgia in 2008. The OSCE simply did not play any decisive role at all. That is a pity because the OSCE has enough potential. Recently, German Chancellor Angela Merkel sharply criticized Putin for his interference in the association agreement between the EU and Ukraine. Foreign Minister Guido Westerwelle repeated the criticisms at the Foreign Minister meeting of the OSCE in Kiev. Is the Cold War bloc mentality continuing in the OSCE? Yes, this is linked to the nationalistic politics which Putin practiced in the Russian Federation. All unsolved territorial conflicts for which the OSCE has mechanism to solve are paralyzed. That is the case for South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and also for Moldova and Transnistria. These are all regions which are de facto occupied or controlled by Russia. That is also the case for the Karabakh conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. This means that there is now a new East-West conflict. The OSCE receives special attention for its election monitoring missions. For many years, this was a successful story and very important in the last democratic post-Soviet states. These missions were also discredited because after the 2013 elections in Armenia, the OSCE published two different official statements. Are these election monitoring missions insignificant now? I wouldn't say insignificant. For example, think of the first elections in Bosnia-Herzegovina, which were organized by the OSCE only 3 years after war, expulsion and genocide. And in Kosovo, it was a similar case. The OSCE did a lot for building democratic structures and the realization of democratic elections. And even today, I would say that the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights in Warsaw is one of the leading organizations. But the pressure from all political forces significantly increased, and that leaves its marks. Therefore, taxes are not carried out as efficiently as before. In 2015, the conference marks its 40th anniversary. By then, the OSCE wants to have repositioned itself. What chances do you see for fundamental reforms, and what should they be? I think in the current constellation, it will be very difficult to carry out fundamental reforms in terms of human rights and democracy. if there are no internal changes, especially in the Russian Federation, without a new political orientation, especially because of the principle of consensus in the OSCE. I see very few options for great leaps inside the system. Russia has to decide if it wants to be a European state and if it wants to play a responsible role among the European powers and not an escalating role. The legal and OSCE expert Manfred Norweg lectures international law at the University of Vienna. Between 1995 and 2003, Norweg worked at the International Court in Bosnia-Herzegovina. In 2004, the UN Human Rights Commission appointed Norweg as special rapporteur on torture issues. He is research director and co-founder of the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute for Human Rights in Vienna and member of a group of experts for the United Nations. Facebook's growing pains. Fewer young people are using Facebook and turning towards the plethora of other social media sites. Is the world's largest social network getting old? Facebook has grown up. At least that's what researchers dealing with the behavior of young internet users are saying, and the user numbers reflect this. The social media network has a problem in 2013. Users under 35 years are gradually turning to other platforms that are more interesting for them. That news came from no less an authority than Facebook's chief financial officer, David Amberman, speaking about the company's figure at the Conference of Financial Analysts. The share price briefly went into a tailspin. But it's not yet a problem for Facebook, said media educator Neil Bergen from Munich JFF Media Research Institute. In the fast-paced social media business, the Facebook platform has become so large that it is currently not in serious danger. That was not true for German student network Study VZ. It was hard hit by the competition from Facebook and shut down its services in Spain, France, Italy, and Poland in 2009. The problem with that platform is that at some point there stopped being new developments, said Christine Venzoff from the Institute for Communication and Social Media in Berlin. Keeping interest growing. With Facebook, it was different. We can already say that the platform is outdated, but that's not a big issue. Venzoff said. The company is trying to remain interesting with new apps and features, he said. This helps to maintain the number of users, even though with younger users. This only works to a limited extent. They increasingly want a separate network for each function, Venzoff said. Young people share photos with Instagram and they can chat via WhatsApp or Snapchat, which are growing quickly. Few social media experts believe this will be fatal for Facebook. The average lifespan of social networks on the internet is 5 to 7 years, but examples such as the were Westwend, Who Knows Whom network in southern Germany showed that while user numbers can decline over time, a dedicated core of users remain. And if the competition poses a threat, Facebook simply buys it, as most recently in the case of Instagram. Lack of privacy, no problem. But why is the number of people under 35 falling? A distinction must be made between young adults and teenagers. The researchers agree. School children increasingly find it uncool when their parents, teachers, and football coaches sign up for the network. The belief that Facebook is infested with parents has become widespread. They also don't go to the same bars as their parents, Wenzel said. Another problem that is often raised is something young users are mostly indifferent to, but also have trouble coming to grips with: the lack of privacy. The privacy settings on Facebook are very complicated and hardly anyone actually knows who can see the things they post. The network has become quite youth-unfriendly, Wenzel said. Users were previously shown all their friends' news, but now Facebook only shows selected posts. Back then, everything was much more interesting, he said, adding that he believes Facebook has simply become too complicated. Users prefer to switch and the barrier to other portals have fallen. Previously, no one wanted to use other networks because they did not want to re-enter their 40 friends, Bergen said. Today, they don't need to worry about that anymore. Smartphones will take care of this. And those are the devices most young people use for social media, like the popular chat service WhatsApp. All in all, Facebook has lost approximately 1.2 million users in the US in the first quarter of 2013. Research firm Social Baker estimates. Passive participation. But Facebook doesn't need to panic yet. For one, user numbers have always fluctuated. Bruggen says the numbers are less about people leaving Facebook and more about lower active participation on the platform. And there are still users who are older than 35. They continue to remain true to Facebook, and that too can be explained. They are often interested in business and politics pages, where they find what is relevant to them. Moreover, they are often happy using a single internet portal for networking, while their children are increasingly looking for new places they can spend time together. Facebook has simply grown up.